back to the afternoon session of 300 Years of Linnaean Taxonomy. We had a number of diversity of presentations this morning about historical to contemporary taxonomy. We're going to kick off this afternoon with Dr. Michael Donahue, who's currently director of the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale University. Mike received his training at Michigan State University and then went on to Harvard University, where he received his PhD. He had a number of positions before ending up at Yale the last 5 years. Mike has been a leader in the charge of phylogenetic systematics and using phylogenies to understand the evolution of life. And today he's going to give us a different perspective on Linnaean taxonomy and talk about, should we seriously consider an alternative system of nomenclature? Michael?
Okay. First, I really want to thank John Kress. It's typical to thank the organizers and so on, but in this case, it has special meaning because John Kress knows very well that we disagree about these issues about nomenclature, and so I thought that it was really great that he invited me to come and speak to you. And it took some kind of wisdom or courage or something, or maybe he just wanted to see me embarrass myself in public. That was probably... Anyway, I am gonna ask the question: should we seriously consider an alternative system of nomenclature? And I guess I can answer that question right now and say yes, of course we should. And furthermore, we should always do that. I mean, we should do that on a daily basis. And if we're not doing it, we're not doing our job, basically. So the answer to that question is yes, we should always be considering an alternative. So we can think up better things to do, we should do them. Now, I don't know if you can see the little Baptist church sign there, but it says, if you can't see it, it says the PhyloCode, Satan's nomenclature. And so it's interesting that this PhyloCode has got to the point where there's people giving sermons about it in Baptist church. But actually, I think one could make the case that it's not really Satan's nomenclature. It's more like Linnaeus' nomenclature than you would guess right off the bat. Linnaeus sort of leavened or updated by Darwin's thoughts on evolution and updated further by Hennig's thoughts on phylogeny. And it's a kind of a combined, in my way of thinking, it's a combination of Linnaeus, Darwin, and Hennig that brings us to the PhyloCode, and I'll explain a little bit along the way what I mean by that. But first, I think it's important, given my commentary on rank-based nomenclature in the literature, it's probably first important to establish that in fact I am a big fan of Linnaeus, and so it's sort of appropriate to be here in that sense. And other people probably don't have to make a case about this, but I sort of figure I do need to make a case. So why am I such a big fan of Linnaeus? And there are several reasons. One, the most obvious one, is I consider him to be the father of bioinformatics. And bioinformatics, the term didn't come along for another 300 years practically, but he was doing it in the early days, and he was really out front of a leader in trying to deal with information coming in from all quarters all around the world. And he came up with a really nice, simple system that we've heard people talk about this morning. So that's a huge accomplishment, and of course that's why we mostly recognize him. Sometimes we call him the father of taxonomy, but that's okay too. But he also did other things. I mean, I think you could make a credible case. I've heard it made that Linnaeus was the father of ethnobotany, and of course his trip to Lapland and that we heard about earlier was the start of a lot of ethnobotanical thinking. You may not know that he's probably the father of dendrochronology, counting tree rings. He sort of made the connection for people between ages and tree rings and so forth, and made a point of that. And here's one that I didn't know till recently, but I think it's just amazing. He's probably also the father of biological control. And I don't know how many of you knew that, but to me it's a well-kept secret. And listen to this quote. He says, until now, no one has thought about exterminating insects with insects. This is Linnaeus. Most every insect has its lion, which persecutes and exterminates it. These predatory insects ought to be tamed and taken care of so they can purge plants. Isn't that amazing? So he's the father of biological control. And probably the father of many other things. Now, of course, Linnaeus was human and had a lot of faults, and he's probably guilty, I think, of commissioning a few too many portraits of himself. And this is kind of widely known that he really went crazy with portraits. And I think he must have had a very big head. And I love this quote, the first line of it: perfectly at ease with his own greatness, he recommended that his gravestone read Prince of Botanists, and he couldn't have minded that his portrait was painted more than 500 times. So, he understood his own greatness even at the time that he lived, unlike many people who become heroes. The other thing that's interesting to me, and I'm now going to tell you a little story that I find fascinating, and maybe you've heard it, but I sort of doubt you have, because it's kind of buried a little bit. I want to say that even though he's kind of portrayed in sort of angelic terms here, maybe he wasn't so great about sharing the credit for some of the things that he did. And so I'm going to tell you the story about Arditi. Arditi was a colleague and a student colleague, a friend of Linnaeus, who they overlapped. They were about the same age. Actually, Arditi was 2 years older than Linnaeus, but they overlapped in Uppsala and got to be close friends. And later, Linnaeus named a genus in the umbelliferae, Artidia. And it's a beautiful plant. You can see it right there. But the name Artidi, where you find that the most in names of taxonomic groups, is in the fishes. And ichthyologists know Artidi very well. In fact, they know him as the father of ichthyology. That's another thing. Artidi was the father of ichthyology. And actually, Linnaeus and Artidi sort of developed ideas together, as I'll make out in a moment. So Linnaeus was very much involved, too, in ichthyology. But this is one of many fishes named after Artidi. So who was Artidi? Artidi was a student, as I said, at Uppsala. He was working on a natural system, basically. They ended up working together on this and had many conversations and got to be fast friends. In fact, it got to the point where they got to be such good friends that they agreed that if one of them died before the other one, they made a pact that they would publish the other guy's work and make sure that it got publicized. And so they knew that they were working on a big problem, and they were excitedly talking about it. In fact, as it says here, Linnaeus and Artidi had a competition to see which one of them knew the different groups of animals and so forth. And they divided it up on the basis of some discussions that Linnaeus would take, for example, the birds, and Artidi would take the fish. And they sort of divvied it all up. And in fact, Linnaeus took all of the botanical subjects except for the umbelliferae, because Artidi had a particular interest in umbels, and so he went and did that part. And Linnaeus pretty much adopted Artidi's treatment of the umbelliferae. So that's the idea, is they got to be friends, and they were talking about these things and exchanging ideas a lot. Now, after they were at Uppsala, actually it ended up that both of them went to Amsterdam, and Artidi was hired by this guy, Albertus Seba, who was a wealthy guy who was building up a kind of a wonder cat at an early museum, and he was getting stuff from all over the world. And Seba hired Artidi to come and catalog his fish, because he had a big collection of fish that was developing. He wanted an authoritative catalog of this stuff. So Artidi went and stayed in Amsterdam, and actually he stayed some distance away from Seba's house, but he would go over to Seba's house in the evening, and they'd have dinner and drink and stuff and talk about the collections. And as it emerges, many good things came from those discussions, including some wonderful outputs from Seba. You may know about Seba's thesaurus. There's these beautiful paintings of all different kinds of animals, and some rather fanciful stuff too. But anyway, one evening when Artidi was over for dinner, he walked out of the house to walk home, and this is the only portrait I was able to find of Artidi. In fact, this may not be a real portrait of Artidi, because I'm told by some people who know better than I that there's not really a good painting for sure of Artidi. Anyway, he walked out of the house, and he fell into a canal, and he drowned. And a very sad ending to a very bright young guy. He was actually just 30 years old when he drowned in the canal in Amsterdam. And so we lost a great guy. Now, as it emerges, Linnaeus did actually publish, as he said he would, Artidi's materials, and he put together his stuff and published it some 3 years later, 1938. And this is what that looks like. So after he died, Linnaeus made sure that this stuff got published. It's actually really remarkable when you look at this ichthyologia, as it's called, because it's laid out in exactly the same form as Linnaeus's work. I mean, it came in sort of 5 sections, and each of the sections had a title that was basically similar to the sections in Linnaeus's work and so forth. So they were very much arranged in the same way. And in 1735, this was the year that Artedi died. This was also the year that Linnaeus published the first edition of Systema Naturae, as we've been hearing. And this is one of the fold-out sheets of the animal names and so forth. And I've just highlighted the fish there. And the fish is actually taken directly from Artedi's work. So in other words, he just adopted full-fledged Artedi's work there. And he didn't mention him. That's what this gets back to the point about not exactly crediting. In later editions of Systema Naturae, there are references to Artedi, but not right off the bat here. Actually, there were some interesting mistakes in this. For example, the whales were with the fish when you look at it closely. That's kind of interesting. Then that was later corrected by Linnaeus as we learned more about that. But now the interesting part of the story, the part that just kills me, and I hesitate to even mention it to you, is that there's a suspicion among some ichthyologists. They have a kind of a conspiracy theory going on that Linnaeus actually killed Artedi. And so it turns out that they've put together a fairly credible story about this. There's an actual ichthyologist and historian named Ted Peach out at the University of Washington in Seattle. And Ted has actually written a book-long manuscript about this, which has never seen the light of day, but I've actually seen some of it. And he puts together a pretty credible story. Not so much, actually, so at first it was like Linnaeus pushed him in, but that didn't hold water, basically, because Linnaeus was in Amsterdam. It was definitely true that he was there, and he was there on that day. But he was actually, as we heard later, he was out at Clifford's place working with Clifford in his garden at that time. And he probably wasn't on that evening anywhere near the downtown Amsterdam area. But then there was some suspicion that maybe some of his students were involved. Linnaeus' students were unaccounted for. Anyway, it's a bizarre story, and I'd be anxious to hear if any of you know more about it than I do. I think it's really a fascinating story, and eventually you'll probably see it in a book that Ted Peach will publish, because he's made a big deal out of it. But I'm not here to say that Linnaeus was a murderer. So don't get me wrong. Don't quote me on that. But it is true that I think the message I want to draw from the whole thing is that whenever there's a great guy like Linnaeus who comes along and comes up with something really brilliant, there's always some other guys working on the same problem at the same time. There's a small community of people, at least. And that's certainly true for Darwin. It's certainly true for Hennig, for any of the people that you would think are great, people who came up with great ideas. They're not out of the blue. There's always a community of people that they're working with. And Linnaeus was no different. And in particular, Artedi, I think, was very critical to the formation of Linnaeus's ideas. And in fact, this is in a nice historical account of Artedi. It's the only good historical account of Artedi that you'll find by Wheeler. And it says, of Artedi's contribution to the final synthesis of the Linnaean method, there could be no doubt that it was considerable. Probably without Artedi's stimulation in his formative years, the Linnaean method would not have taken shape so early in Linnaeus's career. Possibly, it might never have crystallized at all. I mean, I suppose it probably would have crystallized, but I think it's an interesting point that he's making, that there was a dialogue, and Artedi contributed to the synthesis as well. Okay, now on to the more serious part of the talk. So the first thing I want to do is talk about rank-based codes, which, by the way, I don't associate with Linnaeus for reasons that will become immediately obvious. But what's wrong with these rank-based codes? So I want to give a sort of a brief critique in a series of slides about that, and then I'll get on to talk about the PhyloCode and so forth. So in my view, a major problem, there's three that I'm going to list. It could be broken down more finely, but one of them is the form of the name depends on the rank. So the name, the structure of the name, the ending of the name in many cases depends on what rank it's recognized on. And so if I decide, for example, to broaden the circumscription of some family Adoxaceae, then what used to be called the Adoxaceae has to be now called some other thing, like a subfamily, like Adoxoideae or something like that. So as I change ranks around from one rank to another, I'm actually changing the names. And so you can have changes without any real new knowledge, let's say, of how things are related or anything like that. You can have multiple name changes occurring. And this can sometimes cascade, as has been shown in the literature. So a single name change at a given rank can cascade above and below that into name changes at other ranks. And that, I believe, is an impediment. At least I, from personal experience, believe that it's an impediment, because I was always waiting to publish my classification of the Dipsacales until I could really understand everything about it. And then I would go and give ranks to everything, because until I really got the whole thing together, I didn't want to willy-nilly go in there I didn't feel like naming clades one at a time as I discovered them. Instead, I was going to wait, and then I'd get it all straightened around with the ranks, and I wouldn't have to change it again, because I knew if I changed anything, I'd have to change a bunch of other names too. So I was sitting around waiting to publish my classification of the Dipsacales for that reason, and I suppose it's been an impediment in other cases as well. Now, interestingly, I mentioned that Linnaeus is not so closely connected in my mind with the rank-based codes, and actually Kevin DeCuros, who's here at this museum, and possibly here today, I haven't seen him, but, oh, there he is, right there. So Kevin DeCuros has written a very interesting paper, a little analysis he did of comparing Linnaean to rank-based to phylogenetic nomenclature, and looking at the connection between names and parts of trees and names and rank and so forth like that. And basically what he showed in his analysis, and it seems to me to be a pretty good analysis, is that if you go back to the time of Linnaeus to looking at Linnaeus and his contemporaries, that Linnaeus and his contemporaries would often change the rank of something without changing its name. So that, for example, right in the middle of this diagram, you see class Amphibia, recognized by Linnaeus, was changed by Scopoli in 1777 into the tribe Amphibia. But he didn't have to change the name. He just kept the name Amphibia, and he transferred from class to tribe. And just similarly, order Reptilia became division Reptilia without changing the name. So the point that Kevin was trying to make here was that actually, these guys were more strongly associating the name with taxa than they were with ranks. So they would keep the name for the same group, even though they might change the rank of it. And that's where Linnaeus and contemporaries differ from the rank-based codes, where the decision was made to tie the form of the name to the actual rank. So there's a closer connection in the rank-based codes between the name and the rank than there is the name and the group. And actually, if you go back to Linnaeus and his colleagues, they weren't doing it that way. And I think that's very interesting. In fact, Kevin, this is a slide I lifted from Kevin, and he sort of made the point in this paper that phylogenetic nomenclature is kind of what you get when you add Linnaeus and his attitudes about nomenclature to phylogeny and evolution. Here's another thing that's related point that's I've singled out, that rank assignment is now fundamentally arbitrary. In fact, it's always been pretty much arbitrary. If you think about it, it could be made non-arbitrary, but we haven't really done that. For example, as Hennig suggested, it could be tied to age. In other words, everything that's a family could be from the late Cretaceous, and everything that's an order could be from the Jurassic and so forth. But we haven't done that. And so right now, taxa that are given the same rank are pretty likely not to be the same in terms of anything that we can think of. They're not equivalent in terms of number of species, or in terms of ecological breadth, or in terms of their age. And yet, and this is the problem for the scientific community, we're sort of tempted to use them as though they're equivalent. And even the most well-meaning people will actually make these kind of equivalent statements implicitly in using taxonomic names. This is just a simple example, by the way, of how angiosperm families are not equivalent in terms of age. This is a tree of angiosperm families, and from that you can extract information about the ages of those families. And if you put together a graph of that, it looks like this, where actually there's a bunch of families of angiosperms that are around, say, 60 to 70 million years old. But the range is really great, from, say, 20 million years old to 160 million years old. So these things are not equivalent in terms of age. That's what this shows. A third, and actually the most important thing in my mind is this one, that names under the current system actually lack precision. It's not clear exactly how a name maps onto the underlying phylogenetic tree. So, and I'm going to show that in a series of slides now. Adoxaceae is not necessarily, it is necessarily the family that includes Adoxa, the type, but what else it contains is unclear. It's the thing that's recognized as a family that includes Adoxa, but it doesn't otherwise tell you what the limits of this family are. And this is just illustrated here. I mean, here's a little tree, and we know that Adoxaceae's got to include Adoxa. It's the family level group that includes Adoxa. But I might circumscribe it differently. In fact, I could just draw it a little bit broader and a little bit broader and a little bit broader. And there's nothing about Adoxaceae or the way that I named it that's going to tell me where I drew the line. There's clades, after all the way down, to the beginning of life. And I could have drawn Adoxaceae anywhere. My concept of Adoxaceae could include a lot of stuff. So anyway, the basic idea is we don't know what's in Adoxaceae until we ask somebody. We have to ask an authority. It's not clear from the name itself how it maps onto the tree. We have to ask somebody like me. I'm sort of an expert on Adoxaceae. You could come and ask me. And that's pretty much what you'd have to do. It's like, what do you include in Adoxaceae? And I tell you. But somebody else might tell you something else, right? That's why we do things like sensu so-and-so. And, by the way, this gets even worse. There's a subtlety to this that I think is really interesting. And that is that you and I might agree on exactly which extant taxa are in Adoxaceae. So we might actually, both of those circles that I've drawn up there in red actually contain the same 3 species, let's say. But one of them actually includes this extinct form down further, a little bit further. I drew it a little further down, right? And the other one doesn't include it. And so the question is, right now we lack precision about what's included in Adoxaceae, and that gets even into this subtle stuff about whether we include these extinct things or not. So that's a problem, I think. A problem for good communication, and which is what this stuff is all about. So the question is, how does phylogenetic nomenclature intend to deal with those shortcomings, or how does it deal with it? And the answer is, the key to it is what's called phylogenetic definitions. So I'll spend just a minute on phylogenetic definitions. These, I think, I hope you'll agree, provide a great deal of precision, but also combined, as I'll show, with a great deal of flexibility in how they're applied. And once defined, a name sticks with a clade. No changes with changes in rank if you use ranks in this phylogenetic nomenclature. You can use ranks if you want, or you don't have to. It's not necessary. Whatever the case, though, the rank does not connect directly to the name of the taxon. So the name of the name and the rank are sort of dissociated from one another. By the way, this phylogenetic definitions I consider to be a very fundamental thing, independent of the PhyloCode, and I'll make that point later. Whether you do or don't like the PhyloCode is of no, I don't care actually. But whether you care about phylogenetic definitions, I think you should, and I think everybody will. These were invented more or less by Kevin de Quiros and Jacques Gauthier and sort of expanded by other people in a series of papers. And I think we're just now starting to recognize the fundamental importance of phylogenetic definitions. So how does that work? How does a phylogenetic definition work? So this is one type of phylogenetic definition called a node-based definition. So I'm saying X, that taxon that I'm naming, that circled red thing, X is the least inclusive clade containing specifiers B and C. So do you understand that notation? X is the least inclusive clade containing specifiers B and C. What this provides is a standard. It's like what computer scientists call a standard, what database people call a standard. It's a formula. It's formulaic. It's a kind of a way of formulating a node-based definition that has this form. Okay? And I'm showing you one right there. But there's other sorts of clades that could be circled on here. For example, this is a clade that includes the same species, B and C, but it also includes that stem down beneath it, right? And we can be very precise in including that under a branch-based definition. So this says Z is the most inclusive clade containing C but not A. So it contains C but not A. So it has sort of what we call an external specifier in that case. It has an internal specifier and an external specifier. So again, it's a very formulaic way of sort of putting together a definition. And then a third type, which has been discussed, is called apomorphy-based. So we can say Y, this taxon Y, is the most inclusive clade exhibiting the red character, whatever the red character is, synapomorphic with that found in B or in C, or in B or C, if you like. But the point is, it's a way of sort of signifying everything that evolved that character, everything descended from the first thing that evolved that character. So it turns out that you can be very precise about where you want to pin a name on a tree, and you can give it a very formulaic sort of standard definition of one type or another. A node, apomorphy, or branch-based definition allows you to be quite precise about where you're putting how you're associating that name with the tree itself. And that's the beauty of it. And as I'll argue, it's terribly necessary for anything we're going to do in informatics coming down the line. But the first point I want to make, though, about it is that it's quite flexible in terms of how these things can be applied in dealing especially with uncertain relationships, because everybody knows that we're still in the very fledgling stages of understanding about phylogeny. So from day to day, we're sort of increasing our knowledge and changing our knowledge. So how do we deal with that and do phylogenetic definitions? Well, there's a bunch of flexibility built in. There's been a lot of clever thinking about how to make these things even more flexible, and I'll just give you an example of that. the example I want to give you depends on the distinction between a crown clade and a total clade. A crown clade, one in which all the branches arising directly from the basal node have extant descendants. And a total clade is composed of a crown clade and all organisms that share a more recent common ancestor with that crown than with any other mutually exclusive crown. And that's a little bit of verbiage there, but you can see it, I think, pretty well in this diagram. So all the things at the tips here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way over to J, are extant organisms. And you can see that that crown clade that I've labeled there, all of the branches that are descended, no matter how they're related to one another, this is unresolved, all of them, all of the branches stemming from that node that I've labeled there are extant, have extant representatives in them. Whereas I've labeled some extinct things along the branches there. I think you can see that. And the total clade goes all the way back to that node that I've marked with an X. But anyway, having made that distinction, it allows us a great deal of flexibility in formulating phylogenetic definitions. So for example, even though I'm uncertain about the relationships of F, G, H, I, and J, if I want to name that node X, I can do that by just using this kind of definition. X is the most inclusive crown clade containing H, but not D or A. I've just circled those so you can see them easily. And the idea is that I've now got a perfectly stable name for that crown clade, even though I don't know the relationships of F, G, H, I, and J to each other. So no matter how those end up getting resolved in the future, assuming that there's still those outgroup relationships intact, then this is a perfectly stable name. So that's a nice idea, how to make these things flexible in the face of uncertainty, phylogenetic uncertainty. Now, this slide just says there's actually many other ways to deal with uncertainty. One is by the use of what's called qualifying clauses. So you can say the least inclusive clade including X and Y, unless it turns out that X is more closely related to Z. You can build that kind of flexibility into a definition so you can presage some potential change in our knowledge about phylogeny. Or you can use what are called internal or external qualifiers, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Or in the end, just like for the current codes, like the ICBN, there's an adjudication mechanism. There's a group that could adjudicate anything and conserve names or reject names and so forth. So it's got the same functionality as the current codes in that regard. Now, I want to show you some of these in application. And now I'm going to show you a series of slides from a paper that has come out recently in the journal Taxon. It's called Towards a Phylogenetic Nomenclature of Tracheophyta. Tracheophyta are the vascular plants. And this is a paper published by Phil Cantino and a number of other people. Phil was definitely the leader on this. And I'll show you some real examples from that paper. First, though, to clarify, it's a kind of a curious situation with this paper. It got published by Taxon in an abbreviated form because they didn't want to publish the whole thing, which was like a 150-page manuscript or something. So you'll be confused by it. I have a feeling people will be confused because you go to the actual article and it says we're describing 20 we're giving names to 20 clades. And then it sort of refers to a supplement where 33 others are named. And in the supplement, you get 53. And it's all going to be very confusing to people how this worked. But basically, we wanted to go through the vascular plants and name a bunch of very prominent groups within the vascular plants and demonstrate how to use this kind of methodology. And so you won't be able to see that too well, but that's the baseline tree that we accepted for these purposes. And every one of the dots and other things on here represents a different kind of phylogenetic definition for the name of some clade. And so we named overall 53 clades if you look at both the supplement and the one that was published. And this is a part of a table that shows we went through for these 53 names and characterized what kind of definition type we ended up using for them, where BN stands for branch modified node based name. I just told you about that a minute ago. A is an apomorphy based name, so on like that. That's just showing you what we did. This was meant to be the reason we wanted to do this project was just to do a real world application of the PhyloCode, to give it a real trial in a real case and see what we could do with it. And it turned out to be a lot of fun to do, and I hope a good demonstration of how to use this methodology. And basically for each one of these names, what we did was we had a standard form of a protologue here that included the authors of the name. In this case, it was Phil and myself naming something called acrogymnospermy. It comments on the names, the definition of the name, in this case a node-based with external qualifier, comments on the definition, a reference phylogeny, something about the composition, and something about synonymy. So we did this as a very standard format for these 53 names. And I'll just show you a couple of examples just to highlight how this works. And that little box in red down there, I'm just going to blow that up and show you what we did with seed plants. So here is a case where we actually made use of all three of those types of definitions I said earlier, a node-based name, an apomorphy-based name, and a branch-based name. And we gave names to each of those because we thought it was useful to have names for each of them. And just to show you this in a little more detail, this is a tree that shows the relationships of see there's 5 major groups of seed plants at the top: conifers, ginkgos, neophytes, cycads, and angiosperms. And that was the crown clade that we wanted to name. But it was sometime earlier that the seed evolved. And actually there's some seed plants around that are not in the crown clade. So they're actually along the stem. There's some fossils that have seeds, in fact, quite a few of them. And then going back even further, there's some plants that we know are related to, or we think are related to, all these seed plants that don't have seeds. And they're contained in this total clade. And so what we did is we applied the names this way. We used spermatophyta for the crown clade. And in general, that's the way we worked. We said, let's take the commonly used name, seed plant, spermatophyta, and apply it to the crown. And then we also gave a name for the everything stemming from the evolution of the seed, because we thought that'd be particularly useful to sort of, because there's a lot of confusion in the literature about these things, and there's a big fossil record, so we thought it'd be useful to have everything with a seed have a name. And then panspermatophyta includes also the so-called progymnosperms that are related to seed plants but don't have seeds. So the definition of the spermatophyta is a node-based definition. It just says the least inclusive clade containing, and then we have these specifiers: liquid ambar styracea flua, Pinus strobus, ginkgo biloba, Cycas revoluta, and Nidum nemon. So those are the specifiers for this purpose. And that's a perfectly good, straightforward node-based definition. Panspermatophyta has a branch-based definition. Apospermatophyta has an apomorphy-based definition. I won't go through those with you because we already reviewed how those work in a way. But we use this kind of methodology quite consistently in doing this project. So here's the cycads. There's a crown clade of cycads, but we know that there's some fossils that fall outside that crown clade. So in those cases, we would name the crown clade and then also name the total clade. So we would have Cycadophyta would be pinned on the crown, and Pancycadophyta would be used for the total clade that includes that plus the fossils. And it turns out that this pan clade is a pretty useful device in a way. So the idea is for every crown clade, you can name a corresponding pan clade. You don't have to, but you could if you thought it would be useful. And then in that case, it's kind of fun because the names correspond. So spermatophyta goes with panspermatophyta. Cycadophyta goes with pancycadophyta. So what that means is you get some interesting, nice hierarchical information built into the names that way. I'll just give you one or two more examples and then I'll quit. But basically just to show you how this works. So here's another case where things are kind of unresolved. This is at the base of the angiosperms. And there's a clade that people had vaguely been calling the core angiosperms, and we wanted to give it a name, and we gave it the name mesangiospermi. And to do that, though, we used one of these branch-modified node-based definitions because of the unresolvedness of the relationships that I showed you there. We were uncertain, so we wanted to make sure that this thing would stick in the right part of the tree. So we said the most inclusive crown clade, including Platanus occidentalis, but not Ambarella, Nymphea, or Austrobalia. So you see how that works here. So we named it, we sort of specified something within that group that's unresolved, the mesangiosperm clade. And then we named the three things outside of it, and that gives a perfectly good, flexible, stable application of that name to that part of the tree. So this is just to demonstrate a branch-modified node-based definition. And then I'll give you another example of the same sort of problem of unresolved relationships here that we handled in a different way. This is this name acrogymnospermi, which we use for the extant gymnosperm, so to speak, which has come into the literature quite a lot. People want to talk about this clade, which may or may not exist. We're not so sure yet. But we wanted to give it a name because it's been used so much in the literature. And people had started to just call it the gymnosperms, which is kind of a sloppy usage. So we wanted to pin down the name acrogymnospermi. So the way we handled that was with a node-based definition with an external qualifier. And this is a way to ensure that the name will go away if the clade doesn't exist. It's basically a built-in way to make sure that the name will not be applied or misapplied if this clade doesn't exist. So we said the least inclusive clade containing Cycas circinalis, Pinus sylvestris, Ginkgo biloba, and Nidum nemon. Those are all representatives of the four major extant gymnosperm groups, but not Magnolia virgidiana. And what that does is ensure that if the extant gymnosperms don't form a clade, that if one of them is more closely related to Magnolia, then there will be no clade that exists to have a name applied to it. This thing will just sort of vanish at that point, and acrogymnospermy doesn't get used in any other way. Anyway, the point of all of that is to say there's lots of clever things you can do by way of making really great phylogenetic definitions that are flexible but precise. The final thing I want to say is, just because everybody always asks about it, is what's happening with species in the PhyloCode? And so rather than wait till the question and answer, I'll just say that there's a very nice paper that's been put together to explain what the latest state of affairs. It'll come out in Systematic Biology pretty soon. Kevin is an author on it, but the lead author is Benoit Desrat. And it's an explanation, if you will, of the way the PhyloCode has ended up settling on what to do about species names. And interestingly, after much discussion, the decision has been made about this at the moment, is that species names will be left to the rank-based codes, but that they'll be interpreted and used in a way that's consistent with the basic principles of phylogenetic nomenclature. Now, seems a bit weaselly, like what does that really mean? So I'll just explain it to you here, that the idea is that the first word of a binomen, so there's a binomen, the genus name and the specific epithet. The first word of a binomen is interpreted as a species prenomen under this PhyloCode interpretation, rather than as a genus name. And if a prenomen is used, which it doesn't have to be, it's not tied to any categorical rank under the PhyloCode. Now, I'll allow you to mull that over at your own leisure. It's an interesting way to proceed. It sort of says, well, we'll leave the job of actually validly publishing species names to the regular codes, but after they're validly published, we can interpret them in this way and use them in this way. And they go into quite a lot of detail describing why this would be a good idea. And so I encourage you to, if you're interested to see the justification for all of that, to look at their article when it comes out. Also, you can look at the current version of the PhyloCode. This is in the current version of the PhyloCode that's on the web. If you want to see, it's Article 21. It's a new article that's been added to the PhyloCode that goes into exhaustive detail about how this is going to work, if you're interested. So here are the concluding thoughts. Phylogenetic definitions, I think, are fundamental advance, and they're fundamental independent of the PhyloCode. If we'd never even talked about the PhyloCode, we'd still want to be talking about phylogenetic definitions, and they'd still be necessary in our futures, because what they're going to allow, because they pin names on trees at very specific points, they're going to allow us to do informatics. They're going to allow computers to communicate with one another without having to go and ask somebody like me about what they mean by adaxaceae. You can actually have computers communicating about this. And that will enable us to scan through and navigate all the vast amount of information phylogenetically. And there's no other way that I can think of to do that. And the main thing is we're learning so much so fast, and the tree is so big that we really need these kinds of phyloinformatics tools in order to navigate all this biological information. So we need to be databasing phylogenetic definitions. We've developed a database, but it's still at a kind of an early stage. It'll go along with the PhyloCode. But this is a project that I would like to think that a group like the EOL could potentially take up, is the databasing of phylogenetic definitions that will enable the navigation of all the information on life eventually. I just want to go back and say how fast our knowledge of the tree of life has been growing. There was Darwin, not so long ago, saying, I think, and drawing a little diagram in his notebook. And then Haeckel in the 1800s trying to make a stab at this, but without any kind of good methodology. The origins of good methodology with people like Walter Zimmermann in the 30s in Germany, first coming up with how to do phylogenetic analyses and basic phylogenetic concepts, with Hennig sort of putting that all together, and then with more and more data like DNA and more and bigger computers crunching all of these data, before you know it, we're coming up with looking at the whole tree of life. And it's really been gorgeous, and it's happened so quickly, and it's very much a work in progress. But it's amazing how far we've come in such a short time, actually, in this whole project. But it's getting to be cumbersome to try to navigate all this information and navigate all of the information about the species in the world using this. And that's why I'm so keen on these phylogenetic definitions. I think it is the glue that will make this happen. So the main point I want to make is just as the pace of discovery spawned the advances made by Linnaeus and Artedi, remember they were just being deluged with all this information. Well, we're in the same boat now. We're being deluged with information. I think this necessitates some rethinking and some changes in the way we do the naming of things, and we should take this on as a project. We should say this is our responsibility, and we shouldn't pass the buck and wait for another generation. The time is right to sort of realize that we're in a different information age, and we should take this ball and run with it. And I think the key to making that happen are these phylogenetic definitions, independent of the PhyloCode. And with that, I'll end and look forward to some questions. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to say is that, for one thing, as we discovered in doing this business with the vascular plants, is this is a kind of an onerous task that requires quite a lot of thinking by quite expert people. The second thing is that there's a lot of degrees of flexibility with how you do these definitions to sort of make sure that nothing untoward happens if the phylogeny changes. So you can build in ways in which names go away if the phylogeny changes radically. You can build in all sorts of safeguards into these definitions so that whereas a couple of years ago, I mean, I would have been asking the same questions, like, isn't there a lot of, what about this phylogenetic uncertainty and is that going to wreak havoc with these kinds of names? And the answer now is no. I mean, we've developed all of the mechanisms I think we need to proceed cautiously in a scholarly manner, as we always have, to do this kind of naming procedure and not have to worry overly much if we do it well that we're going to be blowing it. And so I think the answer is we've developed a lot of good techniques to take care of phylogenetic uncertainties. Yeah, Jim. No. Right. Okay. So that's a good question, and it's true you've misconstrued it or you misunderstand it. So, Jim, listen to what I'm saying. Just stop right there. So the deal is that what a crown clade is that everything emanating from that node has some extant members. It doesn't mean that everything up there is extant. So there can be plenty of fossils up in there. There's no problem with having fossils in a crown clade. It's just that every branch emanating from that basal node contains at least one extant organism. So that should pretty much solve your problem. In other words, you can discover plenty of fossils in there, and the name does not go away. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense. Well, no, we could resolve this as a perfectly good dichotomy at some point, and presumably we will. All of these polychotomies will eventually get resolved to our satisfaction. And when they do, then you'll have just two lines coming from that basal node, and if each line has an extant member, then it's a crown clade. And it doesn't matter how many fossils are up in there, too. I mean, there could be plenty of fossils. So if you find a fossil up in there, it doesn't do away with the name. Yeah. Yeah, and you could. so if, right. Right. So, I mean, the basic answer is that there isn't a law that says you have to use this pan or apo prefix or something like that when you name these things. But we thought it was useful. We thought it was kind of neat to be able to sort of embed in there some sort of information, so you don't have to memorize another name that's sort of different. You know that pan spermatophyta goes with spermatophyta and so forth. So we just thought it was a useful thing to do. It's not in any way required or anything. And in some cases there are pre-existing names for the panclades, and especially among paleontologists. I gather you're a paleontologist. Yeah. So in those cases, just go for it. You know. But we thought as long as we're making new names for these things that don't exist, it might be kind of a nice convention just to use it. Yeah. 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 Well, like I said, we just thought it'd be useful, and so we thought we'd try it out. And in the end, I kind of liked it as a mechanism. It's not so, I don't know, it's not so burdensome on the user. I think it allows them to get a little extra information. But I'm with you on the philosophy of not overburdening the name. I mean, the name's just supposed to be a moniker for a clade. You know, that's what it is. There was other question. June, you had a. That's good. I'm that way. So that's great. I mean, yeah. Well, yeah. So you shouldn't feel obligated though, June, to name. Don't stay up late at night worrying about naming every clade. I mean, you're not obligated to name any clades, but. Yeah, well, I think what it is like you said, the tree is so huge, and all the time we're discovering new clades, and we're discovering clades that we want to actually communicate about. And what the PhyloCode provides is the mechanism to, at one at a time as we discover them, is to provide them with a phylogenetic definition and put it in a database somewhere so that other people can communicate about it too. And that's all it is. So as you go about your work on, Aureliaceae or whatever, and you discover a clade, it would really be useful to give it a name if you feel like it, if you feel it's a well-supported clade. Give it a name, give it a phylogenetic definition, and then I'll know exactly what you're talking about, and so will everybody else. But you don't have to make it a burdensome thing of naming everything in the world all at once. I mean, it's really a system that's meant to allow you to name things as you discover them. You've discovered the eudicotyledons or something. Go ahead and give it a name. It's a clade that you discovered. You're not obligated to name everything else at the same time, and that's the beauty of it. And eventually what will happen, if the Encyclopedia of Life or something would take on the task of databasing all these phylogenetic definitions, we'll be able to traverse the whole tree of life using these things. Yeah. So two answers to that. One is we've already sort of done it. I mean, so we've solved that problem. And for our local purposes, we just redesigned all of our databases. It took about a half an hour. And so instead of having to put in family such and such and only have the name be recognized at that level, you just put in the name and it recognizes at whatever level, right? So it's easily fixed in terms of taking current databases like we just modified KEMU, for example, to deal with this ranklessness. But the more serious issue is what you really want to have in the background is a growing phylogenetic tree. This is why projects like TreeBase are so important, because they're sort of trying to compile all of the phylogenetic knowledge behind the scenes. And that knowledge is really going to be critical. In the database that we've designed, the Regnum database, which will go with the PhyloCode, there's actually a place where you enter a tree. You know, I mean, basically, you're sort of entering the tree diagram that that underlay your discussion of this name and the naming of it. So ultimately, what you want to do is couple this thing with the growing knowledge base about phylogeny. And our databasing of phylogenies is absolutely pathetic. I mean, it's just TreeBase, which I helped to found, is a nice idea, but it hasn't really worked that well because people haven't really entered all the information. So you're still left a little bit hanging most of the time when you go to search for trees and relationships. But you know, once we get that working, then you couple that with this database of phylogenetic definitions, and then boom, you're golden. You can all of a sudden traverse everything. Yeah, I don't get what you're saying about that, I think, David. I mean, I'm happy to chat about it later, but I'm not sure. We're probably talking past each other a little bit. We're databasing the trees of the world? Yeah. But the way we have to sort of go in the future, though, is when we talk about things in the literature and among ourselves using names, you know, we'd like to be able to attach that to the tree in some very formal, in some very sort of precise way. Right. No, think about it. Maybe this relates to your question earlier. If the tree changes, right, that definition is still there and it still applies to something, right? It may apply to something that now includes a few more species than you had in mind or a few less species that you had in mind, but it's there as a definition. Everything, you know, the least inclusive clade, including A and B, doesn't go away. A and B are still existing. You might have slipped in another species C into that clade. Sometimes, and there's different reasons why they would disappear. Sometimes they become synonymous with a name that's already been given to a clade earlier. So in the PhyloCode, we also work on the idea of priority. And so if somebody's already named a clade and a name suddenly becomes synonymous with it, we get rid of it. But I want to say to David, this is right where we have to be in these discussions. We should be talking about this as a database problem, as a computer science type problem. And you know, that's how I view this whole project.